All right, today is Wednesday, April 29th. We're continuing our series on World War II. Yesterday was a break day, ideally to give you a chance to catch up on videos if you had missed them. Please make sure that you're supposed to be watching these. I want you to know you're supposed to be watching these daily. If you fall behind a day or two, not a big deal, but catch up quickly. Most of you have already realized by now that at least once every week I embed so far it's been a number that you were supposed to email me. That is the way that I use to take attendance. And so even if you are late, please email me the number that you hear, or the letter, the words, whatever it is, as soon as possible, because I still give credit. So if you have any questions, please email me, but you are supposed to be watching these, and there is some accountability for that. So having said all that, let's continue our series on World War II. We've made our way through late 1944, early 1945. By this time, there is no question as to what the outcome of the war is going to be. The Allies will win. Germany, Italy, and Japan are going to be defeated. The only question is how, and how many men must die until that moment. So a few German inventions in 44 and 45, a few German inventions reached the front lines. They came too late to shape the outcome of the war, and in too few quantities. It is surprising, though, because I think I mentioned this a week or two ago that Hitler started the war in 1939. He felt it should have started in 38. Had the war started in 41, it is much more likely that Germany would have won. A number of these inventions were really world-shaping. And had Germany had 2 more years before the war to develop these nations, they would have been night and day ahead of the Allies in a number of important places. So the first fighter jet, the first operational fighter jet, was the Messerschmitt 262. It was designed as a pure fighter. Hitler ruined it. He determined it needed to be a bomber as well. I'll show you a picture in just a moment and explain further. The V-1 and V-2 rockets were the first long-range missiles that were actually used in combat, and the first rocket-powered plane, I believe that was the Messerschmitt 163, was made in Germany as well. So this is the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, at a time when the best of the Allied fighters, propeller planes like the Supermarine Spitfire, like the P-51 Mustang, even some of the new British designs, I believe the Typhoon was particularly fast. They were topping out at around 400, 450 miles an hour straight line or shallow dive speed. The Me-262, the fighter, it could come screaming in at 550 miles an hour. It was just so much faster than anything. It was well armed, had 20-millimeter cannons. It should have been an absolute monster on Allied bombers. Except when Hitler was first shown the airplane, his first question supposedly was, can it carry bombs? Well, who cares? Anyone can see it wasn't meant to be carrying bombs. It was meant to be a fighter. As it was, even with the few numbers that did arrive to the German front lines units, it was a very dangerous fighter. It was very good, very skilled. So this is the first operational jet fighter. The world enters the jet age through the Me-262. This is the V-1 rocket, sometimes called the buzz bomb. It was the first of what we would now call modern cruise missiles. It flew probably around 400 miles an hour. You can see right here it has these stub wings that would allow it to keep airborne, and this, I think it was a turbojet engine that kept it powered, and these could be launched from France, and they would land somewhere in Britain. Now, they weren't very good at aiming, but many of these actually dropped on London. Later on, a whole squadron of airplanes got good at either shooting these things down, or sometimes what they would do is the airplanes would come alongside these and they would put their wing right underneath this point and lift and turn it over on its side, which would cause it to either break up in the sky or immediately crash harmlessly in the water. So the V-1 is kind of the predecessor of modern cruise missiles. This is the V-2. It is the predecessor of modern, what are called ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. Rather than fly straight, this one, the V-2, went straight up and actually achieved kind of a low orbit, and then it would come down and detonate. So these were particularly deadly. The V-2 was a major threat. The only way the Allies could stop the V-2 was to destroy the launching pads. And so it was a particularly important task of a number of units to find, because you couldn't just launch these anywhere. You can see just how large this area is. The Allies went hunting for these things and blew them away. So eventually they were able to eliminate the V-2 threat, but it was the first of what became today ICBMs. Then we move on to the ME-163. This is not the first of really anything. People realized rocket-powered planes are not particularly useful. This plane only had, I believe, a functional time of about 10 minutes before its fuel ran out. But in those 10 minutes, it was incredibly fast, but just not very useful. But it was the first rocket-powered plane. So you had all these German inventions that certainly did create some problems for the Allies, but not enough to change the outcome. All it did was prolong the inevitable, keep the war going when it was obvious that the Germans were going to lose. In the Pacific, once again, it was obvious that by 44 and 45 that the Allies were going to win. The only question is when and how many men were going to die. So we mentioned this. General Douglas MacArthur had retaken the Philippines. In many ways, Douglas MacArthur is the American version of Bernard Montgomery. Severely overrated generals who made it their purpose to make sure that they got all the glory and credit that they could possibly receive. But MacArthur was supervising as the Philippines were taken. The Americans were drawing closer to the Japanese homeland itself. In February 1945, the United States Marines landed on the very small island of Iwo Jima, a name that would never have been remembered except for the battle that took place there. The Japanese had dug tunnels into the dormant volcano, and they turned it into a fortress. Basically, the entire island was a fortress. The U.S. Marines fought for every foot of ground. It was a bloody, to-the-death battle that men died for every foot. The Marines cleared out caves and foxholes and climbed up Mount Suribachi, which was the highest point on the island. Many men died winning the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is America's rarest and most prestigious medal, reserved only for those who go above and beyond the call of duty. And there were a surprisingly high number of men who won the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima. The Japanese, as expected, fought to almost the last man. In the end, the U.S. won the battle, and they gained an airfield within the range of the Japanese homeland. And this was an important new development. It meant that U.S. bombers could now actually start dropping bombs on the islands of Japan themselves. This is the raising of the American flag upon Mount Suribachi, a very famous photo. Strangely enough, it's actually the second time the flag was raised. The original flag was raised by a number of Marines who got there first. A photographer who was embedded with the Marines wanted them to do it again so he could take a picture of it. And so these men did it again. Unfortunately, there are off to the side over here, there are a few other Marines who were part of the original flag raising who didn't want anything to do with this particular show version of the raising of flag, and they're actually standing off to the side making fun of these guys, yelling out Hollywood Marines, Hollywood Marines. Unfortunately, they didn't realize this was going to be one of the most defining images of the war. And there is a very large statue of this at Arlington National Cemetery outside Washington, D.C., a very stunning and important monument to what the Marines did on Iwo Jima. After Iwo Jima came the Battle of Okinawa. It started in April of 1945. It was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific Campaign. A total of 300,000 people were casualties, meaning dead or severely wounded. This was an early use of mass not an early use, well, it was early, but it was a very large use of mass kamikazes. Multiple United States ships were sunk as Japanese airplanes had been turned into flying suicide bombs and they crashed into them. It was also during the assault on Okinawa that the Japanese sent out the remains of their fleet. By this time, the American fleet had destroyed almost all of the Japanese fleet. The only thing that was really left was the pride and joy of Japan, the battleship Yamato. The battleship Yamato was the largest battleship in the world. It and its sister ship, the Musashi, which had already been sunk, were really the most powerful individual ships afloat, except for the aircraft carriers, and that was the problem. They were built in an era where people didn't realize that the battleships were a dinosaur. They were forgotten and now limited vessel. So the battleship Yamato sailed out with what remained of the fleet in order to make one last suicidal charge on the American fleet. The idea was the Yamato would sail full blast, full speed right into the American fleet, guns blazing, 18-inch guns, by the way, the largest guns in the world, and would sink as many American ships as possible. It did not work out. This is the battleship Yamato. It is a beautiful ship. It's a powerful ship. It was unlike really anything in the world. The closest were the United States Iowa-class battleships, which also very beautiful ships, not as heavily armed or armored, but probably a bit faster, and certainly the difference is they survived. So this is the battleship Yamato. That is the battleship Yamato. The battleship Yamato never made it to the American fleet. The scouts for the Americans saw it, and the United States hammered it. And this was the explosion that ended the Yamato. Many of its men were killed, and it was essentially the end of a suicide run that was fruitless. Men died for no really useful reason, much like what was happening with the rest of Japan. On the battleship, the Battle of Okinawa was like Iwo Jima. It was bloody. It was fought foot by foot. This is a rather unusual scene. There were on Okinawa natives, Okinawans. And these are two Marines who have been fighting for days. They're utterly exhausted. They're taking a nap in a foxhole. And in between them is a little orphan boy who has obviously found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, but was saved by these Marines. And so here they are all sleeping, taking a respite from the battle. After more than 80 days of fighting, the Americans finally conquered Okinawa. They had cleaned out all the opposition. They were regularly striking the Japanese homeland at this point. Every day, bombs were falling. Every day, new sorties were being launched. New missions were being completed. Planners in America were working on two particular operations. One was called Operation Olympic, and the other was called Operation Coronet. They were the plans for the invasion of the Japanese islands. This was going to be much bigger than D-Day. It was going to dwarf D-Day, really. The Americans expected 1 million casualties just for America. Now, keep in mind, for the Americans, this wasn't World War I. World War I, many hundreds of thousands and millions died. World War II, it was a lot more mobile, and though very intense, usually fewer people died in the battles. In the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, well under 50,000 men died in both battles for the Americans. But here they expected a million combined deaths or serious woundings. And that was just for the Americans. In the planning, the Americans and the Allies essentially thought that the Japanese would probably fight suicidally every man, woman, and child to the end. They expected the Japanese people to cease to exist. That was the plan in the middle of 1945. I think so. In some of the other places, in China, the last of the Japanese forces were cornered and neutralized in 45. In Burma and the rest of Asia, remaining pockets of Japanese armies had been surrounded or destroyed. The Japanese people were now completely surrounded. Their military was broken. The fleet ceased to exist. Their air force was disintegrating. They had no fighters that could match the Allies. They had no way of even transporting goods to the homeland. Every Japanese merchant vessel was being sunk faster than they could possibly be repaired, built, or even manned. The Japanese continued to fight, however, even though it was well beyond pointless. By the middle of 1945, the end was in sight, and so once again, the big three, that's Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, they met. And this time they met at a place called Yalta. And they were discussing what was to come. What would the world look like once the war was over? Roosevelt, at this point, was serving his fourth term as president, which should not have happened. Remember, George Washington had, after 2 terms, stopped being president. He said he thought that was a reasonable amount of time for any one man, and no American president had violated that precedent ever since then. Roosevelt had violated it. He always claimed that he was essential to the war effort. Some people think that. I'm less inclined to believe that. Regardless, he was very sick and very weak and very mentally unprepared. And that's the important part. By the time Roosevelt's hurting America by 45, he shows up at Yalta. He is weak. He is sickly. He is unable to argue. And Joseph Stalin bullied Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt let himself be bullied because he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been president. Stalin bullied Roosevelt into making major concessions concerning who would control what territory. This would shape the world for the next 50 years. Why does Eastern Europe all fall into the Soviet orbit after World War II? Because at Yalta, Roosevelt was really unable to push back. It's not the only reason, but it is a significant reason. Churchill could see the consequences. Churchill tried to encourage Roosevelt to push back, but Churchill could not convince Roosevelt. Roosevelt lacked the strength, the energy, and he wanted to be done with the fighting. And so there is this massive problem that is beginning to shape up for after World War II. We're going to pick up tomorrow as we're going to discuss really the closing days of World War II. So as I said, please continue to watch the videos. Make sure you're watching them daily. I would like you to write this word down. Please write down the word happy. Write down the word happy, and when you watch this video, I want you to email me the word happy. When you do so, I'll be able to take attendance to note that you were watching the videos as you're supposed to. Please do not discuss this with other students. Every student is on their own. All you've got to do is watch the videos. I'm not even saying that you give 110% focus on them. If you want to watch the videos and do something on the side, I'm okay with that. But I do need you to be participating as much as possible and taking the tests and quizzes as seriously as you can. Okay, have a good day. I'll see you again tomorrow.